You're muted.
Thank you, Malcolm. All right. Thank you, everyone. Welcome and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Lutfi Ramis, and I am a researcher at the Habibie Center, and I will moderate today's Talking ASEAN discussion for the next 2 hours. First of all, as well, I'd like to welcome everyone to the Habibie Center's 22nd anniversary special Talking ASEAN on AUKUS in the Indo-Pacific, balancing or provoking. Thank you for your participation. Now, as we jump to the matter, a few months ago, on 15th of September 2021, Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States launched a trilateral security partnership called AUKUS that aims to serve and share values of freedom, democracy, and to maintain a free and open Indo-Pacific. One of the highlights of AUKUS that took over headlines everywhere in the region and in the world later is the production of 8 nuclear-powered submarines, which would provide Australia an access to nuclear technology in submarine development. The three countries, Australia, UK, and US, will consult for 18 months to seek an optimal pathway to deliver this capability, and the submarine is expected to be completed by 2040. The launch of AUKUS itself has met with both positive and negative reactions from the countries around the Indo-Pacific, in ASEAN, and beyond Indo-Pacific. Some countries embraced the partnership as a way to enhance regional security and stability, while several other countries, such as China, expressed their concern that the partnership could undermine regional peace and stability, could intensify arms race, and could promote nuclear proliferation. On that point, AUKUS could be presumed as an additional force to create a balance of power in the region. Yet, on the other hand, based on the perception towards AUKUS as a sign of arms race, it is possible to see a competition rising out of it, as it could equally provoke other parties to become more cautious and develop more sophisticated anti-submarine options. Many questions arose. For instance, how about the recent development of AUKUS? Or what are the interests of the alliance in the Indo-Pacific region through the establishment of AUKUS? And what are the implications of AUKUS to the dynamics in the Indo-Pacific region? And today we are delighted to have three distinguished speakers to help us explore and answer these questions. The first one is Dr. Malcolm Davis, who is a senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Good evening, Dr. Davis. Glad to have you here today.
Good evening, Lucy. How are you?
We are good. We're good. Thank you. Next, we have Dr. Kuri Maharani Savitri, who is a lecturer at the International Relations Department at BINUS University, Jakarta. Good afternoon, Dr. Kuri. Glad to have you here today.
Good afternoon to you too, Lutfi. Thank you for inviting me here.
Thank you as well. Last but not least, we are also joined by Lieutenant Colonel Fregawenas Inkiriwang, PhD, who is a member of Indonesian Army and a lecturer at the Republic of Indonesia Defense University. Good afternoon, Mr. Frega. We are pleased to have you here today. And
good afternoon, Lutfi. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I would like to say thank you for your service to our nation. And I'd like to thank you I'd like to thank our distinguished speakers for the time they've made to join our Talking ASEAN today, because we know they have busy schedules, and by that, I wish today's discussion to be thought-provoking and also fruitful. And before we start the discussion, I'd like to inform our speakers and our participants that the discussion constitutes two parts. The first part, each speakers will have 15 minutes to deliver their remarks or to present their presentation, and it will be followed by questions and answer session. as the second part of our discussion. With that said, I also would like to inform our participants watching from the Habibie Center's YouTube channel that you are all invited to address your questions by writing them down at the comment section using the format of your name underscore the speaker's name underscore your question. Now, without any further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Davis to give his remarks on the issue. Dr. Malcolm Davis is a senior analyst in defense strategy and capabilities at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, or ASPI. His expertise includes space policy, space security, strategy and capability development, future warfare, military technology, and Chinese military modernization. Dr. Davis, hello, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me give some thoughts, and then I'm looking forward to engaging in a lively debate on AUKUS. On 15th of September 2021, the announcement of the AUKUS agreement between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the US marked an inflection point in how these three Western democracies have responded to rapidly worsening strategic outlook in the Indo-Pacific region. AUKUS represents not just a technology sharing agreement, but also elevates the strategic cooperation for these states as they face a growing challenge from a rising and assertive China. The headline item of AUKUS was, of course, the decision by Australia to move to the acquisition of nuclear-powered and propelled, but not nuclear-armed submarines, with the assistance of its two partners in the agreement. The decision was momentous in that it ended many decades of Australia refusing to consider such a step, despite the obvious military benefits of nuclear submarines. The decision was also motivated by growing concern within Australia's defence and strategic policy community about the slow pace and ballooning cost of the attack-class diesel-electric submarine project with the Naval Group in France. Australia's deal with France included numerous decision gates at which the agreement could be terminated if the project was seen to be failing to deliver the submarine capability that was needed. The failure was certainly apparent as early as the middle of last year and coincided with negotiations between the US, UK, and Australia over the option of acquiring nuclear-powered submarines. The fact that the US and the UK both ultimately supported Australia acquiring nuclear-powered submarines opened the door to an alternative to the attack-class diesel-electric submarines and allowed Australia a new path forward under AUKUS. Australia walked through that door and took that new path, even though the cancellation of the attack-class submarines has caused a major diplomatic crisis with Paris. AUKUS is more than just about the nuclear submarines. It's firstly a technology sharing and access agreement for critical and emerging technologies, including quantum technologies, artificial intelligence, cyber, autonomous systems, including those for undersea warfare, as well as hypersonics. Adding to AUKUS, the subsequent Osman dialogue in Washington, D.C., a few days after the AUKUS announcement, added in greater cooperation in the space domain and new opportunities in terms of changes to US force posture that could see greater US presence on Australian soil, as well as investment in sovereign development and manufacture of long-range missile systems. Also, it's important to note that after both AUKUS and Osman, the Quad Summit emphasized critical and emerging technology cooperation with Japan and India, including in space, which have dual-use applications. Furthermore, the Australian Foreign Minister, the Honourable Marise Payne, high-level defence officials, as well as the Prime Minister, the Honourable Scott Morrison, have contacted our key partners across the Indo-Pacific region, including in ASEAN, to explain the significance and the limitations of AUKUS. So AUKUS represents a fundamental shift for Australia's defence and strategic policies in several important ways. Firstly, the decision to pursue nuclear submarines as opposed to continue to rely on diesel-electric submarines is a key step forward for Australian thinking on naval power and more broadly on defence policy, though it will not be without some severe practical challenges, which I'll talk about in a minute. Secondly, AUKUS, together with Osman and the Quad, opened the doors to a range of defence and technology cooperation efforts that could reshape Australian defence capabilities going forward. and deepen cooperation between the key partners that could fast-track new types of defence capability in the coming decade. But the most important aspect about AUKUS is not the nuclear submarines. It is the message it sends to China about the resilience of a free and open Indo-Pacific region within the existing rules-based international order, which must be preserved. China, of course, has reacted negatively to AUKUS and is seeking to promote an argument that somehow Australia's planned acquisition of nuclear submarines is a threat to international non-proliferation and it will promote arms races. This is utter nonsense. Regarding the nuclear non-proliferation aspect, Australia maintains rock-solid commitment to its obligations under the NPT, and the eventual acquisition of nuclear submarines will be managed with these obligations in mind. Nor should states in the Indo-Pacific region be misled by suggestions that somehow Australia ultimately seeks a nuclear weapons capability. Australia has no plans and will have no plans to acquire nuclear weapons and remains in full compliance with its obligations under the NPT. It should be noted that the 2021 China Military Power Report released by the US Department of Defense last week noted that China is rapidly expanding its nuclear weapons capabilities from some 280 deliverable warheads as of 2020 to at least 1,000 warheads by 2030. China's claim that AUKUS will promote an arms race is equally shallow and misleading, given that it is rapidly expanding its own fleet of nuclear submarines and also ballistic missile submarines, and is outpacing US naval construction to see the PLA Navy become the largest navy in the world, having overtaken the size of the US Navy in battle force ships. Simply put, without China's growing military power and its clear threats to use military force to impose unification on Taiwan, or its actions in militarizing the South China Sea, it is unlikely that AUKUS would have ever been agreed to. In that regard, AUKUS can be seen to be one of the key achievements of Chinese President Xi, who has adopted a much more nationalist and aggressive wolf warrior style international posture that does threaten regional stability and raises the risk of major power war in the coming decade. Australia's defence policy has become quite clear in this assessment. In its 2020 Defence Strategic Update and Force Structure Plan, a key section makes it very clear that the prospect of high-intensity military conflict in the Indo-Pacific is less remote than at the time of the 2016 Defence White Paper, including high-intensity military conflict between the US and China. It also makes clear that the traditional assumption of 10-year strategic warning for such a major power conflict is no longer an appropriate basis for defence planning. Coercion, competition, and grey zone activities directly or indirectly targeting Australian interests are occurring now. China's use of political warfare and grey zone actions against Australia are happening now and have been underway for some years. Australia must respond to this very serious deterioration in our strategic outlook, and we need to do this in concert with our key allies. The AUKUS agreement, together with the Quad and ANZUS, as well as our partners in Asean, will allow Australia a path to strengthen our multilateral defence cooperation that best enables us to undertake our defence policy. This argues Australia must shape the regional security environment to reduce threats, deter actors from using force against the interests of Australia and its allies, and respond against threats when they emerge. AUKUS fits into this shape, deter, respond policy, and the key technology outcomes, including the nuclear submarines, will make it easier for Australia to protect and sustain a free and open Indo-Pacific that is consistent with the existing rules-based international order. That is the goal of AUKUS. Let me just finally turn to some of the challenges and opportunities ahead. Firstly, in terms of some of the challenges, there are some obvious capability challenges emerging from AUKUS, most notably with the acquisition of the nuclear submarines. Under the attack class diesel-electric submarine project, which was already behind schedule and blowing out in cost, the first attack submarine would not have likely entered service until 2034, with the acquisition for the remaining 11 boats proceeding through to the 2050s. For the acquisition of the nuclear-powered submarines under AUKUS, an initial 12 to 18-month period of analysis will look at the best approach to acquiring a nuclear-powered submarine capability as soon as possible. But estimates are now suggesting that the first of the 8 planned nuclear submarines won't enter service until 2038 to 2040. In the meantime, it has become clear that Australia's existing Collins-class submarines will need one, probably two, life-of-type extensions to sustain them in service, at least until the first nuclear submarines appear. Absent either acquisition of a new interim submarine capability to complement our existing Collins-class submarines, or the leasing of an existing, though likely older, nuclear submarine, we face the very real prospect that any delays to the process of life-of-type extension, or the risk that even with life-of-type Collins won't remain seaworthy and effective, could see a dangerous capability cap in submarines emerge later this decade. That would be a serious risk, particularly given escalating tensions over Taiwan and the growing potential for a military crisis to emerge across the Taiwan Strait, which would coincide with that period. There doesn't yet seem to be options for leasing or buying a nuclear submarine sufficiently early to gain a capability in the coming years, and the delay imposed to train submariners on nuclear submarines and establish suitable supporting infrastructure ashore means that we could be without an essential warfighting capability at a crucial time in which the geopolitical nature of the Indo-Pacific is determined. The option to home port US Navy or Royal Navy submarines is likely to be one considered in the next 12 to 18 months. And in the case of the US Navy, has already been made explicit under the recent OSMINT talks. And just recently, a Royal Navy Astute-class nuclear submarine visited HMAS Sterling in Fremantle. Home porting US and UK nuclear submarines and considering mixed crews to train and qualify Australian submariners for nuclear boats is certainly one solution going forward. The challenges associated with acquiring the nuclear submarines raises a broader issue for defence. Namely, there is a clear disconnect between the government's strategic advice on a rapidly deteriorating strategic outlook against the slow pace of capability acquisition. This disconnect points to a requirement for a fundamental shift in thinking on the broader question of the best approach to defence capability acquisition. The nuclear submarine, like the diesel-electric boats that were considered before, represents a traditional approach to capability development that emphasises long-term projects lasting decades to deliver a qualitatively exquisite and boutique, but quantitatively small, high-end capability. In effect, a Lord of the Rings approach of one magical defence capability to rule them all. AUKUS opens the opportunity for exploiting an AUKUS moment to make some fundamental shifts in defence policy, including in relation to accelerating capability acquisition. In particular, the other aspects of AUKUS, notably undersea warfare capabilities, artificial intelligence, and hypersonics, as well as space, could allow a more rapid approach to defence capability acquisition that favours the small, cheap, and many, rather than the large, complex, and costly paradigm. More ambitious and accelerated acquisition of a broad range of advanced autonomous systems in the air, on and under the waves, and on land, together with greater investment into space capabilities and advanced long-range strike systems, open an alternative path for Australia to shape, deter, and respond to growing challenges, whilst we wait for the nuclear submarines. AUKUS allows this fast-track approach, but only if Australian defence planners are willing to recognise and embrace disruptive innovation and make the change that would further shift Australian capabilities away from traditional settings. That AUKUS moment needs to be recognised and exploited, not just in terms of faster defence capability acquisition, but also the challenge in deepening defence diplomacy engagement with key partners. This goes to the shape aspect of Australian defence policy, and we need to engage much more closely with neighbours in Asean and in the Southwest Pacific to explain the significance and the benefits of AUKUS, especially when seen against the growing challenge posed by a rising China. This is an opportunity which we should not waste. Australia needs to effectively use diplomacy, both from within the Department of Defence and through the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and as well through think tanks such as ASPI, to make the case for AUKUS, which is and why it's a very positive development for regional security. There is an important mission here for soft power that is being overshadowed by practical capability issues and the debate over nuclear submarines. AUKUS though it's a technology-based agreement, is also an important geopolitical partnership that is designed to strengthen a free and open Indo-Pacific region. But this latter aspect can only be realized through better defense diplomacy at all levels within states outside of AUKUS. That includes our critical defense and foreign partnerships in ASEAN and in the Southwest Pacific. And it's that diplomatic track that must run in parallel to important capability and technology developments which underpin AUKUS. And I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you very much. You're muted again, Luthi.
Microphone. Okay, I think it's working right now. Yeah, a bit of technical errors, but yeah, it's settled down. Thank you so much for the insightful remark, Dr. Davis. From what I've noted, that AUKUS is beyond the production of the ESSN or the nuclear-powered submarine. It is a technology sharing. It's a leap for Australian defense and strategic policies, and instead being misunderstood as the promotion of arms race, it's rather a message about the need to preserve the resilience of a free and open Indo-Pacific within the rules-based international order. And you have also emphasized the need to cooperate between each party in the Indo-Pacific region, and including ASEAN. As we talk about ASEAN now, we will listen to what Dr. Curry has to say in regards to AUKUS and what is the impact to ASEAN as a region that it constitutes the Indo-Pacific, a region in a broader sense. Dr. Curry is an international relations lecturer at Binus University, whose specialization are conflict and security studies. And prior to her time as a lecturer, Dr. Curry has been actively working on the issues of defense management with Ministry of Defense of the Republic of Indonesia, National Development Planning Agency or Bappenas, and Rajaratnam School of International Studies. Such an impressive records, Dr. Curry. Dr. Curry, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lutfi. Before I begin, I'd like to convey my utmost appreciation for the Habibi Center for continuing the dialogue on AUKUS and inviting me to contribute to the exchange of ideas and knowledge. In the same panel with Malcolm Davis, whom I can only admire from afar, sir. I've read your publications, so many of them, and also with my colleague, Dr. Freda Wenas. I was asked to talk about AUKUS from the defense and security lenses, especially from ASEAN's. And there are two issues at least that needs to be addressed. The first is, next please. AUKUS and the outlook of defense policy in ASEAN member states, and AUKUS and South China Sea issue. Should defense be a priority to ASEAN member states? Next, I would like to propose three arguments as follows. First, AUKUS has highlighted a disunity within ASEAN, which is not something new actually, but it might push ASEAN into a strategic paralysis, as in unable to respond appropriately to the increasing geopolitical risk. And the second, the current arms dynamic between American coalition of the willing, if we are willing to call it that, especially AUKUS and Quad, shows that changes in the balance of power rests on the capability of the US and China to shore up their defenses. Now the US still retain leverage, but China might be able to catch up and take the lead later on. While ASEAN remains militarily insignificant compared to the superpowers, but also refuse to take sides. And the third, South China Sea is at risk to become the next flashpoint. Although I agree with Dr. Malcolm Davis that Taiwan would be the first and the the primary, hopefully, first point in the future. But following ASEAN's failure to engage China into self-restraining manner and the presence of US and other countries in the area through freedom of navigation operations, this might increase the risk of open conflict in South China Sea. So to prevent that, ASEAN needs to redefine the principle of neutrality, embrace under ZOPFAN, that ASEAN exceeded at the height of Cold War in 1971. So AUKUS signified a number of things actually for ASEAN countries. First, Australian choice to take side with US after years of trying to maintain position as independent ally. This is run against the unspoken policy of many ASEAN members who wish to maintain a hedging policy as long as they could. And the second, AUKUS actually reminds us so much of the Cold War, when Australia is part of the most advanced alliances that share the level of technology and intelligence unmatched by others, as previously explained by Dr. Malcolm. That later on transformed into what we know as Five Eyes, whose existence is so vital during the Cold War that even Australia realized that itself will be the primary target of the Soviet. And now the machinery is revitalized, but it's for a different enemy. And the third, AUKUS is yet another additional to the already complex multi-layered security architectures in the region, and automatically ASEAN would see this as further dilating its effort to maintain a central positions in managing the security of the region. So in response to AUKUS, ASEAN has been disunited. Three members, as we can see here, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand have been more concerned rather than welcoming. And three other countries like Singapore, Vietnam, and Philippines are more welcoming than, although not without concerns, of course. And the rest of the members remain silent. The difference in attitude is also influenced by the fact that Australia only had bilateral informations relay just before the announcement of AUKUS. And although a bit late, Australia actually declared that it has committed to Australian centrality, has not changed, and also to the non-proliferation treaty. And predictably, as China immediately gave strong reaction and concern about nuclear proliferation to non-nuclear country. This is similar to concern shared by Indonesia and Malaysia, and also Philippines. But interestingly, China itself hardly does any restraint by planning to add at least 8 more nuclear-powered ballistic submarine by 2030. So what are the possible repercussions of AUKUS /Quad to ASEAN? Next, please. Well, nuclear-powered submarine cannot be categorized as nuclear weapons. It has some strategic use that experts say it might position the Australian Navy at the heart of new Western posture built by the US in Indo-Pacific. And we understand that the submarine could function as escort, deep strike to shadowing and neutralizing Chinese as SPN, hence reduce its second strike capability during nuclear war. And the nuclear propulsion adds the endurance to more than 2 months and operational distance up to South China Sea and even Taiwan Straits, poking holes in Chinese A2AD capability. And while it might not propagate nuclear arms race, it would position some ASEAN maritime countries in the line of fire between China and the US coalition, most notably Australia, which will also be a prime target in the case of open war. And in short, AUKUS intensifies arms dynamic and power projection, which increase geopolitical risk for ASEAN as well. Next, what exactly the position of China and AUKUS in the dynamics of global armaments today? I think Dr. Malcolm has mentioned that China has more surface warships than than the US. But based on our research, we use 11 typologies of global weapon system. The United States, we found, is still the largest operator of military capabilities in the region. Most notably in the air and underwater combat weapon systems, which account for 30% and 50% of the world, and 25%, sorry, of the world's inventory. However, as a global hegemonic, the United States must deploy its military power, so it is stretched over in several areas, while China has the advantage of focusing its military deployment on Asia-Pacific. Next, further research on three main determinants of arms dynamics, namely the defense economy, military budget, arms production potential, and the level of technology adoptions reveals that US is leading at the moment, but may not be able to maintain leverage over its main competitor, China. Currently, US having the largest percentage of budget, military budget per GDP, allocates the largest research expenditure and also modernizes technology. But China has the greatest potential to catch up. If it boosts its military expenditure, it could move from the left position to the right position and taking over the lead that the US has been holding for so long. I know that some of the foreign experts disagree this, referencing that the US has a unique national innovation systems, but we need to acknowledge that China also, being deprived of foreign technology access, they also build domestic innovation systems, which is quite impressive. And in addition to catching up with US in conventional weapons, China is already at the forefront of developing new technologies such as UUVs, hypersonic missiles, and also long-range drones for targeting anti-ship ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. And we can also get a perspective on how small ASEAN members countries are compared to the superpowers. Indonesia, who might be the only country to stand a chance to confront the superpower militarily, is currently at the position of arms maintenance, meaning it can hardly modernize its inventory. Indonesian average age of defense equipment currently is 18 years for the Army, 22 years for the Navy, and 15 years for the Air Force. Not impressive. Similar conditions suffered by Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, and Myanmar. Only Singapore is in the category of arms buildup, acquiring more than 60% of latest technology for its inventory. And in the opposite, Philippines is currently at the stage of arms reduction, having no means to replace old inventory on the brink of disposal. Next, please. Is South China Sea going to be the next flashpoint in the Indo-Pacific? We are trying to figure out where the tension between the superpower could go, unleash into an open conflict. None of us expect and want to have that, but it's a possibility that we cannot ignore. So, although many believe it is Taiwan that is the primary flashpoint in Indo-Pacific, but there's a growing concern that South China Sea might also be a possibility. In Venus University, we are compiling data set on maritime-based conflict between parties in South China Sea and North Natuna Sea. And although the data set is not concluded yet, that's why I cannot show you yet. We are hoping to be able to release that by the end of the year. But we see so far from our findings a disturbing pattern in number of conflict. The number of conflict escalates, and so is the number of parties involved. We record at least 44 conflicts in the past 10 years, with significant numbers of events in the past 2 years. The parties involved are not limited to claimant, but also outside powers such as UK and US. And it's important to note that, that most of these conflicts remain low-key and not escalated into violent event. And nevertheless, the trend confirms the limitation of ASEAN as regional conflict manager. For example, until now, negotiation with China on code of conduct on South China Sea remains a work in progress for more than 1 decade. And experts criticize that ASEAN's working mechanism, characterized by consensus-based decision-making, face saving and informality, has been manipulated by China to advance interests by militarizing islands and deployment of maritime militia protected by Coast Guard to control area of dispute. So China actually used both military and non-military means to achieve objectives that traditionally can only be achieved using military means. But it is unlikely that South China Sea would erupt into an open war for a number of reasons. The first is ASEAN still maintains recognition from China as the legitimate player in managing the South China Sea dispute, and also member of AUKUS Quad are ASEAN dialogue partners. And second, although ASEAN countries are not unified in the stance in relation to China, arguably they share the same perspective that that South China Sea conflict is not at a scale to threat claimant state survival or even regime survival. Countries like Malaysia and Indonesia do not go to war over territorial claim, instead rely on international law for problem solving. Also, to some, economic might take precedence over security issues, hence issues like supply chain, investment, and trade would matter more to local politics. Third, considering the deficit in military power between ASEAN members who are claimant of South China Sea, as well as Indonesia, whose ZE in Natuna waters have been also subjected to China's claim, open war is really not an option. However, this doesn't mean that ASEAN members are doing nothing. Next, in order to balance the position against China, some members like Philippines and Vietnam have gone closer to the US for support through joint military exercises and transfer of weapons. Indonesia as well negotiated for some new technologies such as F-15EX from US that even US Air Force will only be received next year. But this does not equate with taking sides with either superpowers. And our research on the patterns of dependence to foreign arms among Indo-Pacific countries actually show that in the past 12 years, there are 9 countries that reduce dependence on US weapons. Those with largest reductions in dependency to US weapons are Philippines, Thailand, and Malaysia. For the Philippines, this might be reversed by their current agreement with US. And there are 3 countries that are increasing their dependence on Chinese weapons, although not all significant. For example, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Bangladesh. Thailand is the latest addition with procurement of submarine. So we can see that the ASEAN member countries are still maintaining their hedging policies, even in defense matters. So what should be the focus of ASEAN ahead? Next. Actually don't have much to offer, and I don't think anyone at the moment have much to offer either about what direction Asia should take. Many experts have discussed the possibility of ASEAN being neutral by referring to zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality principles. However, ZOPFAN itself has been subjected to multi-interpretation and transcend in accordance with context it was facing. And previously, neutrality was taken as keeping the superpower outside the region. Now it has been redefined as keeping the superpowers in, but ASEAN must maintain impartiality. And against that, have different operationalization about what impartiality means. Indonesia maintains neutrality by, for example, not providing services to military, to foreign military, and not allowing their weapon systems in operations to use Indonesian soil. But some members like Singapore and Malaysia have already had foreign military under FPDA arrangement stationed on their soil. And 2 days ago, in a discussion co-organized by CSIS and RSIS, a Malaysian colleague raised this neutrality issue when talking about Asian outlook on Indo-Pacific, and Singaporean colleague rebutted the idea by offering the concept of safety. And this further continuing divergence on agreeing which principles can ASEAN still hold on to and useful in navigating itself in the post-AUKUS geopolitics. To conclude, my talk, AUKUS highlights the disunity of ASEAN member and deficit in each country military capability. Or still, its member may not be agree on how to respond in the event of strategic surprise, and then trapped in this strategic paralysis state. It is important for ASEAN to revitalize itself, and I think ASEAN is going through a soul-searching period at the moment. And also for ASEAN to continue its persistence in the belief that international laws should be the main tools to solve problem, not military. And in defense matter, to borrow the concept that my colleague Evan Laxmana has mentioned several times, it's important to us to start formulating the concept of armed neutrality, one that perceived as content enough deterrent for superpowers not to drag their conflict into ASEAN territory, but defensive enough to be judged neutral. And to have the whole members to agree is perhaps equal to impossible task, considering the divergent interests and not all members are directly involved in the South China Sea issue. So ASEAN might turn to unilateral mechanism, building a coalition of willing within itself with the lowest common denominator to agree that open conflict between its member and superpower and among superpowers, in ASEAN territory must be prevented anytime in the future. I think that's all I can offer for this discussion. Thank you. I return to Lutfi.
Thank you for your comprehensive presentation, Dr. Curry. What struck me the most is that although AUKUS might not propagate nuclear arms race, however, it places ASEAN in the land of fire between China and US coalition. Thank you, Dr. Curry. Before we move on to our next speaker, Mr. Frega, I'd like to remind the participants watching on live stream on YouTube to write down your question on the comment section, and do not forget to write your name and the name of the speaker you want to ask. Now, we have Mr. Frega with us today, and Mr. Frega is a member of Indonesian Army and also a lecturer at the Republic of Indonesia Defense University. He began his career as a lecturer at RIDU in 2013 and earned his PhD in international relations from the London School of Economics. Lieutenant Colonel Frega had his book 333 Dharma Prajurit Kujang published in 2015, and he is an active contributor to several media. Mr. Frega, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lutfi. All right. I think the previous two speakers have already covered a lot, but I'll try my best for my session. Firstly, before I proceed, I would like to express my gratitude for being invited to this prestigious forum organized by the Habibie Center. My topic, actually, I just recently swapped the topic, and I'm going to cover the AUKUS and Indo-Pacific dynamics. Based on the invitation, I'm supposed to talk on the Indo-Pacific perspective on security policy and the arms race concern in the region. Next slide. So basically, I think Malcolm and Curry have covered some of the dynamics in Indo-Pacific by mentioning some significant countries, the key players in the region. So is it working, the slide? Okay. So before the AUKUS was established, the trilateral initiative established by the three countries, US, UK, and Australia, we are aware that actually the dynamics in Indo-Pacific has been so complicated. And even with the establishment of AUKUS, this has made more complex the situation, because we have we have observed that there are various, actors, be it the Quad or Quad Plus, also ASEAN, and and China, and even recently Russia also organized the military exercises with China. So there are also a number of commitment between alliances in this region. Like Corey mentioned, the Five Eyes, the intelligence agreement, which involved Canada as well and New Zealand, and also the Quad, which is the four: India, U.S., Australia, and Japan. And then recently, I think it has been developed by involving France in some of the exercises, which is organized by Quad Plus, and also, if I'm not mistaken, last year uh, Vietnam was also invited along with South Korea. And ASEAN, of course, as just Curry mentioned, explained about the position of ASEAN. And of course, we know that in dealing with Indo-Pacific, ASEAN has also offered its own approach compared to the free and open Indo-Pacific offered by the Quad. So the situation has already complex prior to the AUKUS establishment. Next slide, please. So I think Malcolm already explained this, but what I want to highlight is actually, most of the discussion or most of the publication when we talk about AUKUS in the region, they tend to focus on the nuclear power capabilities, which is, there were only 6 countries possess this one, but with Australia will be joining the club. It will be the 7 countries, and also it's very prestigious. That's why countries try to focus on these dynamics. But instead, there are also various agreement which cover the cyber capabilities, artificial intelligence, quantum technology, and so on. And I think because of the shift of the game of the modern war, AUKUS can initiate a game changer, especially with the introduction of the multi-domains operations and multi-domain battle, where the US and its allies has already, with the NATO countries, they try to, develop not only the land, air, and the Navy capabilities, but also the cyber and also space. And likewise, China and Russia, they have been also developing quite well, recently trying to catch up with the US. Next slide. Okay. One of the key significant point that many countries, especially in the region, pay attention with, having Australia being part of the AUKUS initiative, is actually the undersea capabilities, because having the nuclear propulsion technology, it will allow the submarine to submerge for a longer period of time, and also very quiet. Not all countries in the region that have the technology for detect this kind of capability. So for some countries, this create concern that by having these submarines, even though Malcolm mentioned that perhaps it's going to be in the fleet operated by 2038 or 2040, it just nearly 20 years more. But by having those capabilities, especially the countries in the region, they don't have the same or on par capabilities. That will create concern whether there will be like a special mission exploring the undersea territory of the countries in the Indo-Pacific regions. Next slide. And I think it is interesting, as I pointed out in my previous slide, that there has become a complexity in Indo-Pacific, especially with the presence of Quad Plus, France coming into play with some of the exercises, and also with the post-Brexit, United Kingdom actually proposed to be one of the strategic dialogue partners of ASEAN. And of course, this has changed the architecture in the region as well, because it gave both countries actually more role, especially joining the Quad Plus. And France, if I'm not mistaken, based on some of the articles that I read, involved in the large military scale, which also working together with India, Australia, US, and Japan. And of course, having the a deal of providing conventional France submarine to Australia, but by the establishment of AUKUS, French expressed the disappointment, because the country feel that it's just like step in the back, because just 3 weeks prior, nearly 3 weeks or 2 weeks prior to the announcements of AUKUS initiative, there were a joint statement between France and Australia regarding the deal of the submarine. But within short period of time, then it was shifting, and also there was no consultation before. That's why President Biden, when he spoke to President Macron, that there was some of the process that has been ignored. But despite the situation, I think it is important to learn more how actually other countries also has been affected by the AUKUS. Of course, France, because of the cancellation of the $9 billion contract, it is very fundamental. And of course, we can see after the post-World War II, France has become the strong allies of the US and the UK. And now, without being consulted, the US and UK try to reach Australia to form another trilateral initiative. And I think this is also similar with one of the ASEAN countries as well, like Indonesia, the 2+2 dialogue. It was just organized just a couple of days before, the announcement of AUKUS initiative. So when AUKUS was announced, actually, well, I heard that the government was actually a bit surprised of this kind of development. Next slide. And I think Malcolm and Curry also highlighted this point, that the objective of AUKUS itself is try to contain China. And because China has, in the past few years, I can see from the graph that, visualized by Curry earlier, that China has achieved quite significant development in modernizing and building up. And even at this stage, China also receiving assistance from Russia to modernize its naval capabilities. Next slide. So, of course, negative responses was demonstrated by the Chinese Foreign Ministry promptly after the announcements of AUKUS initiative. The country said that it's against the NPT and also rule of the jungle, And I think this is fair enough, because China, prior to the AUKUS announcement, has been perceived as the major rivalry of US and its allies, which also included UK and Australia. Next slide. And I also include here, actually, Russia is another key player in the region, because in one of the articles that I read, that Russia and China has made some trade-off. Especially Curry pointed out about the issue of South China Sea, and Russia tried to approach China to gain access to the region, because China has become, as one of the big players, as one of the elephant in the room. And at the same time, China also asked Russia to gain access to the Arctic region, which has become the rivalry between Russia and the US and its allies in NATO's in Europe. And I think one of the concern that Russia perceived probably in the long run is the capability of the nuclear power submarine. It can reach very far distance, and also as a commitment to the alliance that Australia has with the US. and other allies, the Western allies. So when part of the commitment, perhaps Russia predicts that this kind of submarine capability can be also employed and reach even the Bering Strait up to the Arctic region. Next. Another important country in the Pacific region that I think is also important to observe is actually Japan, because this country is part of the Quad, but it seems that Japan has been left out, because currently in the Quad, Japan is the only one that will not have the nuclear power submarine capability, because US and India, they have already organized this capability earlier, and Australia will be joining soon. But Japan, one of the article I think I read last week, mentioning whether about the possibility of Japan accessing the same technology as well, but maybe the US will not provide it. And at the same time, South Korea also, because these two countries are the two strong allies in East Asia. So if, let's say that the US and UK will also provide the same platform for the Japanese military, it means that it will provide as well for the South Korea. And of course, if this happen in the future, the game will be more complicated and complex. But I think the situation, especially regarding the first point of security policy of the Indo-Pacific region, in the post-AUKUS, will be developed into a more unpredictable fashion. And I could say that it's a game changer, because many countries will also will adjust with the geopolitics in the region, especially in the Pacific, because as we have witnessed, China recently, based on the satellite imagery, that China has already replicated the US aircraft as the target for its capability to strike the moving target. And I think by having this AUKUS initiative, where expanding the range from the north, and then Indo-Pacific, India to the Pacific, where in the Pacific, US has become the dominant power, and then now extending to the southern hemisphere, which is Australia. It's covering a larger area, where the China's interest is actually taking place. So regarding this matter, I think the security policy making, especially for Indo-Pacific region, countries like ASEAN, Corey mentioned about the growing this unity. So you can see that is the survival of the state. At the end, countries will try to pursue their own interests, their own strategic interests, despite they have the commitment to regional architecture. And I think this is also valid when we see Australia, because some of the analysts, they deliver the thought-provoking question why the New Zealand is being left out, or perhaps some other alliances that's in the region like Japan. Why it didn't it take both parties to join together, because they have already earlier platforms under the Quad or under the Quad Plus. So next slide, please. So basically, the dynamics, even though many analysts or some analysts predicted that it's not going to develop into the nuclear arms race, but as we may see that at the moment, the capability, especially the defense acquisition, defense military platform, is not only relying on the nuclear weaponries or nuclear technology, but the hypersonics or subsonic missiles now they develop with non-nuclear material, which is also have the same detrimental impact on the targets. And you can imagine with the increasing technology, the Western part, the Chinese, also the Russian, it can reach a very wide distance, 1,000 of miles, just within minutes. and also with the AUKUS initiative, where tit for tat and try to trigger respond from in this case China, which has been being suppressed with this kind of initiative, will trigger more actions. And we have seen that the demonstration of China moving the naval fleet and doing large exercises by itself, and also invited Russia recently to join a large military exercise. So it shows that China is still being threatened by this kind of initiative. And as Malcolm and Kuri also already mentioned about this one, and I think having two more players in the region, out of the region, which is France, because of the Quad Plus, and also UK, as UK has proposed and has been considered as the new dialogue partners, it will create more complexity. And with the AUKUS being introduced, the situation will be more complex. And I believe that this will trigger, even though maybe at this stage is very difficult because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Many countries in the region try to curb the spread of the disease, and also that have impacted their domestic economy. But perhaps when the pandemic is going to be ends in the near future, it means that the country will go back to its own natural survivability, which is try to respond to the geopolitics in the region, which is in the case at this stage the AUKUS initiative, perhaps supplemented by the Quad or Quad Plus. And even though we don't know yet how actually Australia and France are trying to repair the relation at this stage because of the cancellation of the submarine contract. And the last point that I want to highlight is actually layer of strategic trust. This is very critical. This is the terminology that I use. As we can see that, France, one of the strong allies of the US, but the country feel it's being stabbed at the back and not being consulted. So again, it goes back perhaps to the basic regime where countries will pursue its strategic interests, which is the neo-realism or realist, because of this complexity. But hopefully there will be, Kuri highlighted this point that there's no silver bullet. Even for ASEAN, it's very difficult whether we want to pick neutrality or safety. Of course, you have to consider not only your foreign relations but also the domestic politics, because they are two interrelated. And I think, in summary, the development in the Pacific region, so responses to the AUKUS, many countries in the region will be divided based on their policy, be it non-aligned countries, perhaps will be trying to maintain its neutrality, but in a way it will try to balance between the economic motive and also security motive. And of course the alliances, being the Quad Plus, or those countries who are affiliated with the US, will stay on track, try to curb China and perhaps to some extent Russia as well, because China and Russia have been trying to develop their capability. And of course, the third group, which is China, supplemented by Russia, will be another key player. And we don't know yet whether the trade-off between Arctic region and South China Sea or the Southeast Asia region will be a good trade-off for these two major powers to develop their capabilities. And I think those statements conclude my presentation. Once again, thank you so much. I look forward to answering any question. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Frega. That was another comprehensive presentation we had today. What I can conclude thus far, that the concern of the possibility of an arms race, it seems not to be not going to happen with the existence of AUKUS itself, as our three speakers have also highlighted and emphasized this point. And once again, Mr. Frega, thank you so much for the presentation. Now, as our three speakers had presented their views on the issues of AUKUS, I would like to still remind our participants watching from YouTube to keep the questions written down on the comment section. Don't forget to write your name and the speakers you want to ask our three speakers. And now we had some of the questions come to our table, and it is so interesting as Dr. Davis highlighted, and it was also highlighted by Mr. Frega in regards to the France and Australian case. In this case, in the circumstance that Australia, France felt that it was backstabbed by Australia because the former agreement was cancelled because of the AUKUS. Two of our participants also have the same questions in regards to this matter, and these questions are addressed to Dr. Davis. Dr. Davis, how could Australia and France do some remedy to their relations after this, after the AUKUS circumstance, and would it be also influence the European Union? I mean, would it be provoking European Union as well in regard to the AUKUS? This was asked by Tangguh Khairil and Fiana. Both of the questions: how could Australia and France do remedy to their relations, and would European Union be provoked as well because of the French case within the AUKUS itself? Dr. Davis.
Okay, thank you very much. And also I'd like to thank the other panelists because they both gave great presentations, which I really enjoyed. In terms of France, yes, obviously we are in a major diplomatic crisis with France as a result of pulling out of the attack class project with Naval Group. I have to say that the French knew the nature of the deal in terms of the exit points within the deal, within the arrangement, in terms of if Australia was not happy with the progress in the project. It's very clear that the project was falling behind schedule. It was blowing out in cost. The French were not taking our interests in terms of Australian industry content very seriously. And we were having difficulty relating to their approach in terms of culture in how they were managing the deal. So by the time we got to the point whereby we were having discussions with the Americans and the Brits about nuclear-powered submarines, we were looking for a way out because the conventional submarine deal with the French was not going to deliver the capabilities we want, and we were concerned that it was just getting further and further behind schedule and blowing out more and more on cost. So that point aside, yes, the French feel aggrieved because we did pull out of the deal very rapidly and without much warning, and then proceeded to announce AUKUS and that we were going to get nuclear-powered submarines from either the Americans or the British. And so they, from their perspective, they do feel like they've been stabbed in the back. But there's an old saying: it takes two to tango here. There needs to be recognition on both sides that the deal went wrong through both sides' actions. I don't think we managed our relationship with the French as well as it could have been. So in terms of how do we get back in the good graces of France and how do we repair that relationship, I think it's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of patience, a lot of diplomacy. And I think we need to engage with them in other capability areas and recognize that they are an Indo-Pacific power. They have legitimate Indo-Pacific interests. So we have to work with them to help them further those interests in the region. without necessarily sacrificing our interests in the process. So, to give you some examples of what we could do, Australia is looking to boost its long-range strike capabilities in coming years in the air. So let's talk to the French about that in terms of new types of air power, new types of missile capabilities, space capabilities that we could work with them on, new types of command and control technology. So there's a range of other deals to be made out there besides the subs that could get things back on track. And there's the broader relationship, I think, that it's in their interest to work with us in the end, because their interests are just as much threatened by China as our interests are. So I think that ultimately what will happen is that it will take some years, but eventually there'll be a rapprochement, and the French will come back to us, we'll come back to the French, and there'll be a dialogue, and we'll get things back on track. And then suddenly new options will open up in terms of how we can work with France on a range of defense projects that maybe are not submarines, but maybe they might be submarine related or air power related or space related. You mentioned also the EU as a second issue. I think that we have good relations with Europe. There's no reason for the EU to act as a spoiler in this. The EU have their hands full. You have a very serious situation emerging on the Polish-Belarus border right at the moment, which is being instigated from Moscow. And I think the EU and NATO understand exactly what's going on there. So I don't think it's in the EU's interest to, shall we say, annoy other key partners, including Australia. So they'll work with the French, and they'll ultimately work with us. And there'll be opportunities going forward there.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. Mr. Frege, do you have addition to this in regards to Australia and France? How could they remedy their relations?
Okay, thank you. Probably I'll just add some point. I think what I see that the process of getting back with France in a good relations might need another player, in this case US, because at this stage, despite all France and US are major powers, but still the superiority of the US compared to the France, perhaps because the initiation came together from US, UK, and Australia. So as one of the stronger power, means that US can perhaps offer something more, and it can be used. And of course, I agree with Malcolm says that it might take some time, especially maybe a different culture that in the defense industry, and how to deal with that one. And of course, this is perhaps in the recent years the first experience that as I mentioned, layer of strategic trust, where you have built over decades those strategic trusts between France and Australia, and in a part of the US unilateral missions abroad, like Iraq, Afghanistan. They work together, they train together, and now suddenly it came something like this. But I think as long as the commitment from Australia, also the using like quote unquote the big brother, which is the US, perhaps it can be used as an alternate approach to re-engage with France. That's my take on that.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Frege and Dr. Davis. We have other questions, and these questions, we have 3 questions from one person actually, and it's in regards to ASEAN and impact of AUKUS to ASEAN. Therefore, it is addressed to Dr. Curry. Dr. Curry, as we know, there is no uniformity in how ASEAN countries respond to the AUKUS. We have learned that Indonesia gives different response as the Philippines. Will there this question come from Mr. Kang, and he asked, first one, will there be a unified statement from ASEAN in regards to AUKUS? And the second one, based on the different response, different reaction, perception on AUKUS, will it affect ASEAN's solidarity and consensus when it comes to future challenge, future external challenge? And that's the second question. The third question is, judging from the recent development of the Quad and the AUKUS, how do they affect ASEAN?
Okay, thank you for the question, Lutfi. It's going to be raining here anytime soon, and you might be able to hear the thunder strike at a distance. Okay, these three questions actually revolve around the same issue, which is, and also Lithuan answers actually. In my perspective, AUKUS and Quad does not really affect that much. I mean, ASEAN since the beginning is not really a unified and solid organization to begin with. It's when we see the history of ASEAN, they always try to respond to any security challenges, Cambodia issue, Vietnam issue, East Timor issue, Myanmar issue, and yet countries could have different perspective because they have different interests, and so far ASEAN survived that. So it is actually quite normal in ASEAN to have that, but ASEAN also need the appearance of being in unity, of course, for the sake of the integrity of the organization. And this apparently has been shattered not by AUKUS or Quad, but also by Chinese influence in some of the members. So basically, AUKUS and Quad are not the only problem here when it comes to ASEAN to maintain its unity. Will it affect ASEAN solidarity and consensus? I think it really depends on the context of the issue. As I said before, not all members of ASEAN will have the same interest in South China Sea issue because not all of them are claimant, and therefore they don't feel that they have to put much stake on the issue. However, I think it is the primary task of ASEAN to be consistent with its own principles, which is the ZOPFAN and the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. And within those principles is actually ASEAN persistence to peaceful means in solving any security issues, and also that the ASEAN believe international laws are the best means to achieve those solutions. And we see that although, for example, in South China Sea issue, Philippines refrain from consulting with ASEAN and take the matters to international court, it still go within the same path that its predecessors have been taken. So how do Quad and AUKUS affect ASEAN differently than before? I think for the first time, ASEAN must face directly the issue related to one superpower, that potentially be involved in the next hegemonic war with coalition of the willing, which include Quad and AUKUS. And that is something that we have never faced in the history before. So how do that affect ASEAN? I think ASEAN have to not just focus on maintaining unity, but redefine what the means of the principles it upholds, the ZOPFAN and the TAC. And I said before that ASEAN needs a soul-searching periods to choose which principles can work in this context, and which principles that ASEAN would probably better to put back into shelf. I think that's what I can offer for the 3 questions.
Thank you, Dr. Curry. Well, actually, I have read somewhere that there someone actually saw Australia's adoption to the Treaty Amity and Cooperation. And Dr. Curry, what do you think about I don't know, evaluation, I might say, that the AUKUS is actually does not actually go hand in hand with the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. What do you think about that?
As much as we disagree with Australia in their choice of strategic response to what they perceive to be threats from China, I think we need to be more understanding about why they choose to go with AUKUS. And actually I didn't mention, although it was in my presentation, but some of the issue that pushed Australia into joining AUKUS is the sense of encirclement by China. And I think for ASEAN countries, we tend to focus more on domestic issues rather than what's happening around us in the Pacific. And some of the issues that are actually happening slowly and gradually, for us, it's become something new and strategic surprise, but it's not. And whether Australia actually disregard TAC by choosing AUKUS, I think I think Australia is doing its best to not rekindle the relationship. I mean, we do have a good relationship with Australia at the moment, and so are some of the ASEAN member countries. And in fact, I believe that Australian Foreign Minister, Madam Payne, is now traveling around and engaging in talk, trying to bring more understanding into the region. So I think that would clarify lots of concern between ASEAN and Australia. However, that does not alleviate our concern about the increasing geopolitical risks. And I think it is positive to see that despite the choice to AUKUS, Australians still see ASEAN still see ASEAN as the central player in managing the strategic challenges in the region. I think that's all I can say, Lutfi.
Thank you, Dr. Cree, for your answer. Dr. Davis, maybe you have something to add?
Yeah, look, let me sort of propose a counterfactual history, if you like, of the more recent years. China obviously rising after the period of Deng Xiaoping, it's becoming more prosperous and so forth. If China had adopted some choices about political reform rather than the Tiananmen Square massacre, it could have maybe taken a risk and embraced some political reform and say, okay, maybe give the Chinese people more choice in terms of their government. If China had the courage to say, let's let the Taiwanese people make their own choices about their future. If China had honored its promise to President Obama about not militarizing the South China Sea and basically building artificial islands to turn them into military bases. If China had not incarcerated over 1 million Uyghurs in essentially what is concentration camps. If it had made these sorts of choices, it could still have continued to rise as a superpower. It could still have basically risen and worked within the existing rules-based order and had prosperity and influence. But instead, what we've seen under Xi is a China that has embraced wolf warrior diplomacy, that has become much more nationalistic, that has become much more threatening, that is building up its military capabilities to match all of that, that is making military threats about taking Taiwan, that has militarized the South China Sea. So in other words, China had the opportunity, several opportunities, to choose a different path. And we would have worked with that China. We would have embraced it and essentially said, yes, China is a responsible partner, let's work with them. And you have two superpowers in the world, the United States and China, working together to solve global problems such as climate change, terrorism, resource inequality, and so forth. But instead, what you have is a China that is basically challenging the existing rules-based order and is becoming a revisionist power. That's our problem. And that's why we've been forced down this path, because China is not becoming a responsible state, it's becoming a revisionist state. And we're not prepared to see a free and open Indo-Pacific essentially lost to a Chinese hegemony, where China basically imposes its will and the regional states, including the ASEAN states, are forced to pay tribute to a rising China. And you understand what that means, going back to the dynastic period. We don't want to see that future. We want to see a free and open Indo-Pacific where all states are equal under international law and are protected by that international law. And that's why, we do have to take the growing challenge from China seriously.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. Now we have other questions, and now these are addressed to Mr. Frega. Mr. Frega, this question came from Indra Wisnu Wibisono, and the question is, what is the impact of AUKUS for us Indonesian? Is it a threat for us?
As I mentioned earlier, that one of the key point under the AUKUS initiative is actually try to elevate the undersea capabilities of Australia. And I think if from realist perspective, usually we will see it in a negative way, which means that a threat to our own territory, because, undersea explorations, even we still remember that a couple months ago, that one of the submarine actually sunk because of the, technical issues. And of course, by having another, external actors and having capability that you don't own, you will feel, of course, naturally feel threatened. But there's a way that we can actually prevent this from happening, is by, increasing or strengthening our defense diplomacy or public diplomacy with Australia, because we are neighbors, perhaps, despite the strategic surprise of the AUKUS initiative, because during our last 2+2 bilateral dialogues that we were not consulted, and then just a couple of days after that, and it was announced. And of course, a recent incident as well with the burning of 3 illegal fishing boats. There are still but there are still opportunities that we can work on, as long as we can align our strategic interests. Maybe perhaps the technology that provided by the US to Australia, and later on we can perhaps learn how to develop this kind of capability as well. But I don't know the commitment with the US and UK, but at least there are room that we can fill, try to strengthen our bilateral, because over decades we have been partners, despite the ups and downs of our bilateral relations. But some of the former Australian officials also reminded the current administration of the importance of engaging with Indonesia, especially one of the big countries in Southeast Asia. And regarding the second question's strategy for diplomacy that will incorporate all parties, this is very utopian view and is very impossible. But there's a way how to optimize the use of diplomacy, and I think defense diplomacy could be one of the way where perhaps ASEAN has the ADMM, where all these major powers are involved. Perhaps we can use this kind of stuff, not only dealing with the non-traditional scenario like counterterrorism, but things that while will be useful for all parties. And we have to be more, more concrete in implementing this kind of initiative. And I think maybe by using ASEAN, despite the disunity that we have, but it's one of the way. And I'm delighted to hear Malcolm's mentioning that Australia will also try to approach through ASEAN as a key player, especially when we're talking about Indo-Pacific. There's no silver bullet for this one, but again, the combination of public diplomacy and defense diplomacy, because military instrument now are one of the key instrument that has been utilized by both China and also the Quad Plus, or even under AUKUS, because the one of the center of gravity is the military capabilities. And I think these two questions are very important to bear in mind, because this will drive how actually the development of the region in the geopolitics post AUKUS. Thank you.
If I can just jump in, there was a
Sure, Dr. Davis, please.
Yesterday, I think it was, or the day before, former Australian Prime Minister Paul Keating gave a speech at the National Press Club, which was incredibly controversial for some of his views that he said. And I won't get into a blow-by-blow description of that, but one of the things he said was, Australia is still trying to ensure security from Asia rather than security with Asia. I think he's fundamentally wrong in that view, because we have had security with Asia for a very long time, in particular with Indonesia and with our ASEAN partners. And we work very hard to work with ASEAN and with Indonesia in particular to build strong ties. One of the reasons why Maurice Payne is up there now doing the diplomatic circuit is to try to explain AUKUS to ASEAN, because we recognize it's so important to maintain that relationship. So I take what Frege is saying. We do have to work hard with the ASEAN states, to work with them and basically try to explain that it's a partnership. It's about security together. We do recognize China as a common threat. There's no doubt about that. Let's not pull any punches. But we understand that ASEAN has a different approach to this issue than Australia does. And it's about meeting and finding common ground in that regard.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. Dr. Curry, another question, and I think this question fits. Could as well be answered by Mr. Frege as well. This question came from Indra. He asked, is it the right time for ASEAN to start being independent and think about itself by making a joint defense pact between each ASEAN member, member states, as a balance of power between China and AUKUS?
Thank you. Interesting question. Perhaps the one who asked the question is to clarify what he means by independent. Is it feasible to use the concept in the world being interdependent at the moment? Independent in what? In economy, militarily, because the two they are interlinked. And the interesting part of living in Indo-Pacific is that how we navigate between economic interdependence and conflict management. So I think perhaps by being independent is being neutral, impartial, as ASEAN envision. But how can ASEAN achieve that? Defense pact, I think it's something that we need to rule out, because really no one in ASEAN has to offer in terms of military capabilities. And some of the ASEAN members has their own defense arrangement, FPDA and others. And and also Indonesia has a free and active foreign policy which rule out any kind of military alliances? And if ASEAN do have such arrangement, can it be operationalized? I cannot imagine a NATO type of arrangement in ASEAN and one member is being attacked and whether other members is willing to deploy its military to respond that. So one of the key issues that I offer in this discussion is what we call armed neutrality. So how to make our neutrality accepted and acknowledged by other parties with military power much larger than us. This is something that's still a work that we need to do as academics. And I think Mas Rega will be able to talk more about the concept because it takes a lot to define the concept and into technical issues. Which kind of postures, what kind of postures do we need to have in each of the ASEAN member? And I think because ASEAN hasn't really talked about this in terms of organization, it's only feasible for us to talk about armed neutrality in the context of Indonesia alone. Yeah, and perhaps Indonesia could formulate an idea and teaching enough for other countries to jump into the bandwagon. But I know that most of the attendants of this discussion might have a predetermined view of ASEAN being unuseful when facing a superpower competitions and the future conflict. But I think we need to settle our expectation with ASEAN, and it is still possible for ASEAN to come up with the new, fresh idea that that revitalize and use and make the principles of neutrality becoming relevant again. So I think I offer Mas Frega a more a chance to elaborate this armed neutrality even more.
Mr. Frega, please.
All right, thank you for the question. This is an interesting one. I think being independent, again, I agree with Corey's explanation. Being independent is not really that easy, especially having various background. You know, all the member countries, the 10 member countries of ASEAN, they have different path, you know, and even the size of economic development as well. There's an imbalance between one country, you know, like Indonesia, Singapore, and also the demographic. So as I mentioned earlier, even at this stage, the ASEAN is focusing on their own domestic in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. And it seems that, you know, most countries in ASEAN have refocused their defense budget. So, of course, if relates to the next point, when we try to establish defense pact, it's even more difficult because, you know, when we want to establish a defense pact, we have to possess sufficient resources, which is the financial support, and also the economic development, which in this case we have been really impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think if we compare the aggregate of all the military capabilities of the 10 Southeast Asian nations, it's still down below. We can't match the Chinese or even the US or even one of the other major powers, you know. So it's very difficult. And a defense pact, if we invite, you know, one of the major power, let's say defense pact with the Chinese or even with the Russian or the American, it will complicate the situation because at the end we'll create another new of hostility with which perhaps all the Southeast Asian countries cannot deal with even collectively. And that's why one of the strategy that has been adopted for, I think, for years and decades. We try to balance, using the regional approach, as Evelyn Go refer as the omni-enmeshment. When we're dealing with the rivalry between major powers, usually we try to use our collective regional approach. But we also supplement with the bilateral approach with any of the major powers, even though maybe in reality it's not really that ideal, because sometimes we have arguments. Curry in the presentation also pointed out the growing disunity. Even in responding to AUKUS, there are various responses, whether be it indigenous defense industry and also military build-ups. We don't know, but at this stage, it's very far from that scenario, because currently we are focusing more on the domestic, be it in the states or within the within the region itself, because there are disunity in there. And I think each country also in ASEAN has different views in formulating their foreign policy. Some countries might have defense pact with some of the major powers, like Thailand and the Philippines, that have the pact with the US. Also, Singapore and Malaysia, they are still part of the FPDA, even though maybe it's not really as resemble like the defense pact that the Thailand and Philippines have with the US, but still the commitment. They train together. They also have the liaison officer. They have foreign posting as well among these 5 countries. And of course, it's the commitment from the beginning in establishing ASEAN is also different. And if we remember Seattle as well, it tried to replicate NATO in Southeast Asia, but it didn't really work, and it was disbanded at the end. But maybe reformatting perhaps how the ASEAN think and how the ASEAN behave could be one of the way. I mean, at this stage, we still have issue with Myanmar and how we deal Myanmar as one of the member countries. We are restricted by the TAC, where to some extent we cannot intervene in the internal affairs of our member countries. But maybe if there's a adjustment to this kind of limitation, perhaps that will open windows of opportunities for a greater ties as collective entity within ASEAN. Hope that answered the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Curry and Mr. Frega. Dr. Davis, we think it's really interesting to ask this question. AUKUS, thus far, AUKUS has gained mixed reception from ASEAN members. How do you think it could complement the security needs for the region, given the fault lines? And it comes from Arizal, our participants. Thank you.
Look, I think I go back to what I was saying earlier. We do see Australian security with Asia as our basic approach. So we do want to strengthen our relationship with ASEAN in sort of working with them on defence. We understand, basically what Dr. Curry was saying in terms of armed neutrality. That is a challenge for us, because from our perception, to put it bluntly, we don't see that you're going to be given the choice of having armed neutrality. Chinese will simply impose their will. So somehow we have to square that circle and work with ASEAN in terms of cooperation with them on defense and national security. And AUKUS, I think, it's not just, as I said, it's not just about the nuclear submarines, it's about a range of other capabilities as well. We can sit down and work with ASEAN and say, okay, in terms of space capabilities or artificial intelligence or unmanned systems, where can we work together to develop common interests and common capabilities? A classic example might be maritime domain awareness, where autonomous systems and space capabilities and artificial intelligence, the sorts of things that will be enabled by AUKUS, can play a role in both ASEAN and Australia working together to deliver constructive and practical military outcomes that benefit both sides. But obviously, yes, there are more challenges when we start to think about the major power threat of China and how we respond to that. And I do think that there needs to be a dialogue and a discussion on that. And it may be that, that's a bridge too far at the moment, that ASEAN can't meet us in that regard. For so many years, we took the approach that our security was with the United States, but our trade was with China. And so we sat on the fence in that sense. We tried to balance that relationship, that triangle. And I think the last few years, it became impossible to do that because of China's political warfare against us, that had been going on for a number of years. So we've made the choice. AUKUS is about making the choice. And we've got off the fence and we've said we need to work with the US and the UK to counteract a rising aggressive China. I think that for ASEAN, it's very clearly still trying to balance that relationship between China and the United States. And when you talk about armed neutrality, that's at its essence, that's what you're talking about. So it's a case of how we get around that. And I don't really have a good answer to that. All I can do is suggest let's do small steps and let's look at practical, deliverable outcomes that can actually improve our cooperation in meaningful ways, but don't necessarily.
And we have another question from Taufan that it's asked, how could Australia, maybe in the long term, build the trust of ASEAN in regards of the defense diplomacy? As Taufan said, that defense diplomacy has always been based on trust. And how could you explain or give us a bit insight on how would Australia build the trust with ASEAN?
Well, I would say that really trust shouldn't be under challenge here. AUKUS is not a development that is negative for ASEAN. We're not, as a result of AUKUS, threatening ASEAN. We're getting nuclear-powered submarines to counter China, not to threaten ASEAN or Indonesia or Malaysia. We're using AUKUS to develop new capabilities in space and cyber and hypersonics to counter a rising China, not to threaten ASEAN. So I don't quite understand why there is this mindset that somehow AUKUS is a threat or a betrayal of trust to ASEAN, because it's not. It's about strengthening our ability to protect ASEAN's interests as well as Australia's interests. It's about, as I said, strengthening the resilience of a free and open Indo-Pacific region, which I presume is what ASEAN wants. I think that the question, how do we restore trust? Well, it shouldn't be an issue that we need to restore trust. What it should be is, how do we use AUKUS to strengthen the relationship going forward? Because AUKUS is a positive development for the region. It's not a negative development for the region. The only state that is saying that AUKUS is a negative development for the region really is China. I know there are some in ASEAN who claim it's a threat to nuclear non-proliferation, but I think everyone understands that Australia is not about to get the bomb. So it's really China that is, I would put it, is trying to push this line that somehow AUKUS is a negative development, and it's not. It's a positive development.
All right, thank you, Dr. Davis, Dr. Curry, and Mr. Frega for I think it's a wonderful set of questions and wonderful set of answers as well. But before we finish the discussion today, I think it would be better if the three of you, the speakers, would give the final remarks to these topics. AUKUS in the Indo-Pacific, balancing or provoking. Start from you, Dr. Davis.
Okay, well, no surprises. I'm going to say it's a positive thing. It's certainly not a provocation. Chinese don't like it. Okay, we accept that, but we don't make our defense policy based on what pleases Beijing. We may make our defense policy on what we need to ensure our security interests are protected and the interests of our allies, including those in ASEAN. So we see it as balancing China. We see it as ensuring we have greater ability to deter China We don't want war. What we want to do is deter China from using military force aggressively in the region, including against Taiwan. AUKUS is about that. Now, there are some practical aspects that I think are problematic. The long lead time on acquiring nuclear-powered submarines is probably the most apparent one. But the more important issue with AUKUS, even more important than acquiring nuclear submarines, is the elevation of Australia's role in terms of AUKUS as a key arrangement for security cooperation, our ability to work with the US, the UK, and with our partners in the Indo-Pacific to strengthen security and resilience in the face of a real challenge. And I think that's really what we need to focus on. The submarines will sort themselves out in time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. Dr. Curry, please.
Thank you, Lutfi. I think AUKUS is a geographic reality that we must admit, we must acknowledge. Whether it will be a balancing power or the other way around remains to be answered by time. I think it's too early for us to judge the nature and the implications of its existence. And I think ASEAN has the main task to not to keep the unity within its members actually, but to remind all the parties involved, all the parties that has a stake in Indo-Pacific to remain loyal to international law and if AUKUS bring in new technologies, and I think ASEAN should also see it as opportunity to gain some benefits due to its dual use interest as emphasized by Dr. Davis, and I think perhaps AUKUS is. AUKUS has intrigued us because some of ASEAN members might have thought that is this the way ahead for some ASEAN members, that one day we'll be forced to choose in between. And I think as long as ASEAN members could stand together in rejecting those temptations, and we might have to think how to do that. I think that's the biggest question at the moment, and I think let ASEAN do its soul searching, and hopefully it come up with a better solution. That's all, Lutfi.
Interesting. Thank you, Dr. Curry. Mr. Frega, please.
All right. Thank you. I think my summary point on the AUKUS is a game changer, especially for the Indo-Pacific region, either for those part of the alliance, for the Western alliance, or even for China and Russia, or even for those non-aligned countries, because to some extent, despite transfer of technology, just nuclear propulsion technology, but to some way it also affect how actually defense and military operate in the region, because some countries might not have the same capability as what has been over by the US and UK to Australia. But the good things, as Malcolm and also Curry mentioned, that there are windows of opportunities for cooperation as well. Transfer of technology, Australia can serve as a hub for leveraging a number of technology offered through the initiative. But I might say, if I have to choose between balancing or provoking, at the initial state of AUKUS, it is intended for balancing, but at the end, it's also encouraged provoking, because as I explained in my presentation, different responses from China, Russia, France, or even in Korea explained about Southeast Asian country responses. But I'm optimistic that despite the pro and cons of the AUKUS, there are still opportunity to engage to ASEAN to mediate the tension between rivalries or major power rivalries in the Indo-Pacific region. And once again, thank you so much for the opportunity and invitation from the Habibie Center. And also, I'm honored to be with my two prominent colleagues, Dr. Malcolm Davies and Dr. Kuri Maharani. Once again, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Frega. Thank you so much, Dr. Kuri and Dr. Davis. And thank you so much for all of the participants. We have a lot of questions actually, but taking into account we don't have so much time to discuss all of those questions. I, on behalf of my team, really sorry for the participants if your questions are not asked. However, we hope that this discussion is fruitful and would be beneficial to the next development of the security and the stability of our region, especially. Thank you so much for all of the speakers. Hope you're well and healthy. And for all of the participants, we wait you for our next agenda, Talking ASEAN agenda at the end of this November. More info coming soon, but we expect you to be there, hopefully. And thank you so much for today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.